how are mental health issues taken into account within the homeless application legal framework? Now, as you'll see quite quickly, mental health issues are directly relevant to a number of those kind of key ideas within a homeless application process. So even making a homeless application itself, the definition of homelessness, the definition of priority needs, intentional homelessness would also come into it as well. And things like the suitability of accommodation that you're then offered, those kind of things are relevant. And all the way through, you've got the Equality Act, meaning that councils have to be very kind of aware of people approaching them with different mental health issues, and they need to make reasonable adjustments, really without being chased for it. Yeah, they should do that sort of stuff automatically, but often they won't. So in this video, I'm going to try and just go through these kind of different key points and just kind of illustrate some examples. It's not going to be definitive, but it's going to illustrate some examples of how these different mental health issues might become relevant within these different parts of housing law. And just to kind of, I guess, kind of give a rather clumsy overarching definition of what I'm talking about when I talk about mental health issues. So obviously there's some very commonly known and understood mental health diagnoses like depression, anxiety, PTSD, personality disorders are all probably terms which are in the kind of public consciousness. Schizophrenia, bipolar affective disorder. So you've got lots of things like that. Then with things like depression and anxiety, you've then got kind of subcategories like generalized anxiety disorder, adjustment disorder, all of those kind of things as well. And then you've got kind of, I guess, more far-reaching things like autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, potentially those kind of things as well. And I guess you've got learning difficulties, learning disabilities in there as well. So, you know, it's kind of very difficult to really pin down exactly what we mean by mental health issues. But what's clear is that mental health issues can have a very, very big impact on someone. And being homeless is you know, I can't think of a situation where being homeless is not going to make those issues kind of become much more significant and potentially worsen that person's well-being. So if we use that kind of clumsy definition, I mean, I guess I'll probably extend in here substance use disorders, because they are considered to be mental health issues. They're obviously a little bit complicated. In most cases, they're excluded from protection from the Equality Act, even though they have a substantial impact on someone's ability to carry out day-to-day living activities, which would ordinarily kind of get that protection. So you've got things like that, and potentially there's also some stuff kind of a bit more nuanced and a bit more obscure within the mental health kind of umbrella. But let's kind of keep it as simple as you can, because it's just a quick YouTube video. And if we start with homeless applications themselves, homeless applications and mental health issues are immediately kind of interlinked, and one of maybe the most obvious ways is the fact that many mental health issues will have that substantial impact on your day-to-day living activities and therefore would be considered a disability. And councils, and in fact, you know, and particularly any public body, they have particular things they need to do in terms of the Equality Act to make sure that they identify disabilities and they make reasonable adjustments where they need to. And they shouldn't need to be asked to do that, they should just do it anyway, but often they won't. Often staff will have had no training whatsoever about the Equality Act, full stop. But that means that if you are, let's say you're highly anxious, you know, really kind of suffering with bad anxiety, and actually going into a customer service centre where it's very busy, often very noisy, even that can make it very difficult to actually kind of go forward. And so what you should be able to do is to say, look, I've got, you know, very significant anxiety at the moment. I really struggle with noisy spaces. You know, this also might be kind of true for people with autism. You know, therefore, can you deal with my application differently? Can you, you know, arrange a time when it's going to be quieter? Can you have a telephone conversation if that's going to be better for me? All of those kind of things you can express your preferences. You know, can I be seen in a private interview room? Which, by the way, should be kind of default anyway, because councils are responsible for making sure that they keep your information confidential, and you can't keep your information confidential when you're having a discussion in an open plan customer service centre anyway, but that's probably a slightly different issue. So we've got this kind of idea of people, you know, people approaching councils may well have mental health issues, and there's kind of an overarching duty on councils to have a homelessness strategy where they are supposed to essentially kind of predict, you know, the kind of needs of the people who are likely to approach their service. And because there is a correlation between mental health issues and homelessness, I don't believe it's necessary causation, but correlation between the two, council should anticipate that people are going to come to their service who have these kind of difficulties and these additional needs, and they should therefore design their service to make sure that actually it kind of meets those needs. Often they won't. That's down to members of the public to be, kind of interacting with the council when they do their homelessness strategy consultations and raising particular issues. Certainly in Bedford we have had a lot of luck around those kind of things, and getting even the housing allocation policy to maybe look a little bit more deeply around why someone might have abandoned their property. Maybe it wasn't just a kind of a choice. Maybe it's because they had some mental health crises going on at the time that kind of led to that. So that's kind of around homeless applications. There's actually more to say about this. So for example, is a problem with some councils where if you have significant mental health issues, they'll say, oh, we don't need to take an application from you because you don't have mental capacity to do so. And most of the time that is not true. The law itself is true. If you don't have mental capacity to make a homeless application, then essentially social services need to be dealing with you. So it's not that they kind of they can wash their hands of you, but actually mental capacity again is very misunderstood within housing teams. Again, I've done freedom of information requests around the training staff get for that, and often the training is zero. They have no training whatsoever about how to conduct a mental capacity assessment, and so you have lots of myths that kind of perpetuate within housing teams, where because somebody has these difficulties, particular difficulties, or because maybe their previous tenancy broke down because of mental health issues, it's then assumed that they don't have mental capacity to make a homeless application in the here and now, and that's basically automatically going to be unlawful, because if nothing else, and again this is probably a wider discussion point, but mental capacity fluctuates, and it's kind of when you assess it, you're looking at a particular decision. And really there's some debate around this, and maybe me and Will do a video about this in more detail. But essentially, when someone makes a homeless application, they need to be able to kind of exercise some degree of choice. They need to be able to articulate their preferences, and they need to understand that when they get a tenancy, they need to pay rent, and they need to not act antisocially or whatever. But even if they don't have mental capacity, the next step should be for housing officers to say, okay, we think you're struggling with mental capacity. We're therefore going to give you additional support to help you with that decision and help you or support you through so that you can actually have mental capacity. Now, a good straightforward example of this might be where you've got somebody who's alcohol dependent. They come in at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and they are incredibly drunk. They potentially would not have mental capacity to make a homeless application, although again, you need to carry out an assessment if that's the case. But that doesn't mean to say the council says, oh, this person's got no capacity, they're alcohol dependent. What they need to say is, okay, well, 3 o'clock is probably not a good time for you. Let's make an appointment for you the next day at, let's say, 9 a.m. or something, where you're not so heavily intoxicated. And just because somebody has had a drink does not mean they don't have capacity. Again, it's kind of having a drink would potentially mean that you can then carry out a capacity assessment, because you need to have some sort of reason to think that there might be an issue. You can't just assess everyone's capacity just kind of by default. But again, someone might have had a couple of cans of Tennent's, but they're still well able to understand information, retain it, weigh it up, and articulate it back, which is essentially the kind of the mental capacity test, and therefore be able to make a homeless application. And again, councils can, the debate here is, what degree do you need to understand a tenancy agreement to really kind of have capacity to make, to sign up to it. Bearing in mind, I've worked with lots of housing officers who don't actually understand terms like jointly and severally liable, which is a key term to a tenancy, and yet the housing officers themselves don't actually understand a lot of the kind of legal terminology. So it's obviously not reasonable to expect a Joe Bloggs non-lawyer to understand really the small print of their tenancy, and that just because they can't understand that doesn't mean to say they haven't got capacity to go for it. So yeah, that's again a couple of examples of where mental health might become relevant to making an application. There might be some more, but again, I'm just giving kind of an overview here. The next kind of key principle is going to be that definition of homelessness itself. So there's a really important case from 2018, quite obscure but kind of important as well, where there was a lady called Wendy Lomax who had very significant mobility issues, but was also very socially isolated because she lived in Dorset in the middle of nowhere, no public transport, and her family lived 60 miles away in Gosport, and we had a really good kind of relationship with her, if only she could actually get there. And she applied to Gosport Council, and Gosport Council said, you're not homeless, there's nothing we need to do. And it went to the Court of Appeal, and there's a really complicated argument actually, but in essence the judge said, or the argument goes, that because she had a disability in terms of her mental health, in terms of the impact of of the depression on her because of the social isolation, and because there's very clear evidence from the medics, the GP and so on, that the current accommodation was making it worse, in a sense that kind of made a backdoor to show that actually the council had applied the wrong test, and actually she should have been considered as potentially being homeless, and therefore, you know, the kind of, she won that argument. It's a very high threshold. You know, most thresholds within housing law are not this high, but it's a high one, and you would need kind of very specific evidence really from a GP or psychiatrist to show why it is your current accommodation is having a very significant impact on your mental health. So that's not an argument you'd kind of, you know, you're likely to win really if you just kind of wander into a council. You probably need a solicitor to make that argument, but it can be done. And equally, you know, homelessness as well, you know, you might have someone who their mental health breaks down and they abandon their property. I've kind of alluded to that already. Where actually, you know, they might have had a home, or there might be a home that's available, but something about it, you know, maybe some sort of trauma or some sort of kind of, maybe there's a history of abuse, but it's not kind of directly relevant to the homeless application at this point. Maybe that would mean that actually mental health issues would become relevant in how the council would assess whether it is reasonable for you to continue to occupy that property. So again, I've sort of, my old colleague John at Just Us, he used this this situation where there was a mum and daughter. Daughter had been sexually abused by the mum's ex-partner, who was now in prison. So it was technically safe for her to be in the home, but because of the trauma, because of those kind of sort of triggers in that property, it just was having a very significant impact on the daughter's mental health, and that was evidenced through, you know, kind of children's mental health services and schools and that sort of thing. So that's a situation where, again, you know, it's a high threshold, but you can make that argument. So that's the definition of homelessness. I'm trying to think if I'm missing anything. I don't think I am. So you've then got eligibility, which I can't really see how that would really have a bearing on it. I might be wrong. Again, people might be able to put in the comments if I'm kind of missing something there. But generally, eligibility and mental health issues aren't really directly related. I'm sure some people who are ineligible will have mental health issues, but I don't know how that fact alone will kind of help them get support through the Housing Act. Then that brings us on to priority needs, which is potentially the most obvious one, because people who are in priority need if they're vulnerable because of some kind of health issue, including mental health issues. And the key thing is, and the key case for this is called Paniotu, I think v Waltham Forest, but it was kind of 3 cases rolled into one, or 2 cases rolled into one. So the actual important one is the Smith v Haringey element of that case. It was Court of Appeal, so it's, you know, it's kind of authoritative. And in that judgment, effectively what the threshold for priority need was is that, you know, is there something about that person which, you know, is going to make a noticeable difference to their ability to deal with the consequences of homelessness without harmful effects. Again, I've done videos about this in more detail, so I'm not kind of doing the criteria full justice there. But that keyword noticeable is really kind of important, because I've seen housing advisors and housing professionals say, you know, unless you've got really severe depression, for example, then you can't possibly be in priority needs. But that isn't true. They just, rather than just need to be like an extreme impact of that mental health issue, they just need to be something that's noticeable. And before the Paniotu case, the kind of wording was this word significant. And significant within the English language, you know, is actually used quite elastically. A bit like, you know, when you say, oh, I literally did this, when really what you mean is you figuratively did that. So yeah, this kind of idea of you know, how bad does it have to be to render someone vulnerable? The Paniotu case in 2017 kind of cleared that up, and that use of the word noticeable was really clear, because if you look at the dictionary definition of significant, it does mention you know, it makes a noticeable difference, more than trivial, that kind of thing. And really the Paniotu case, by using that word, kind of was very helpful to show that it doesn't need to be a particularly high, you know, kind of you know, massive impact or severe impact. It just needs to make a noticeable difference. Again, there is a bit more to it than that, but that's kind of, I guess that's kind of how I'd explain it in an elevator pitch of what vulnerability really means. So, you know, lots of mental health issues. You know, something like depression, there's a big range in how it can affect someone. It could be well managed by medication, in which case that person may well not be in priority need. But even with that medication, even with, you know, the CBT or whatever, the kind of treatment that's going on there, that does not necessarily mean that they are not in priority need. And you don't need to kind of add these additional kind of move the goalposts and say, well, you know, unless you're under the CMHT or unless you're under a psychiatrist, you're not in priority need. That's not how the test works. It's all about focusing on how would this person be impacted by homelessness, given what we know about them in terms of their existing mental health issues. And there's another really helpful case, which again we've done videos about, called Thomas v Lambeth, which really showed that, you know, is there something about that person which is going to be made significantly worse or noticeably worse by being homeless? And if so, you know, then that's kind of almost, you kind of met the threshold already. Again, If you want to know that kind of threshold in more detail, probably do check out the other videos I've done about it on the channel. There's also a really good one by Sarah Steinhardt on the channel where she kind of unpicks it even further. So that's kind of priority needs. Again, it can be really obvious. You know, you might have a kind of a diagnosis like PTSD, which I think a lot of people kind of, you know, agree it's a real thing, including housing officers. But you've then got mental health issues like, say, personality disorders, which on paper are actually very similar to PTSD in terms of their causation and kind of what effects they have. And yet kind of personality disorder is kind of often seen as almost not a mental health issue, you know, untreatable, and kind of, you know, what difference does it make? Well, the reality is it can make a huge difference. You know, someone with emotionally unstable personality disorder is almost certainly going to be, you know, noticeably more vulnerable than an ordinary person would be. And that word ordinary there, that's just kind of the wording of the law, so I appreciate it's a bit of a clumsy term. So that's priority needs. Again, don't think I'm missing anything at this point. You've then got local connection, which I'd probably argue, again, I don't see any kind of direct situations when it would be relevant, because within local connection there is this idea of special circumstances where you're receiving treatment, but it needs to be very, very obscure specialist treatment. And a council could legitimately argue and say, well, you know, yes, you're under the CMHT in Bedford, but there's a CMHT in Milton Keynes as well. There's no reason why you can't continue to get the same level of support from them. So that's local connection. And then intentional homelessness actually kind of takes it into account in a great deal as well. So essentially, if you look at 9.17 of the Code of Guidance, it says that acts should not generally be considered to be deliberate where, for example, they arose because someone had an assessed substance misuse issue or an assessed mental health issue, or if their mental capacity was such that they were just unable to manage their affairs. Again, I'm paraphrasing now, I've not got it in front of me, but I'll put it up on the screen so you can see it. And so in that situation, again, you might have someone who, you know, they literally just trashed their flat. They had a psychotic episode, they trashed their flat, they become homeless, they've been evicted because of it. But that doesn't necessarily mean they're intentionally homeless, because it was potentially that, you know, that kind of time when they lacked capacity, because again, it fluctuates, but maybe they had that episode and that was the thing which actually led them to carry out the act which got them evicted. So, you know, you could potentially see this with depression as well. So let's say someone is so incredibly depressed, and you might have issues kind of alongside them like hoarding, that sort of thing, but they're so depressed that they just, you know, they just can't manage to do what appears to us to be simple tasks, you know, making a phone call to housing benefit to get something sorted out, whatever it might be, kind of, you know, just kind of engaging with that bureaucratic system. That just might be at that point in time too much. You know, they might just be kind of so overwhelmed, and, you know, let's say they don't open the post, there's just a letter from housing benefit or universal credit in there just asking for more information or whatever, they don't respond, their benefit claim stops without their knowledge, and then before they know it, they're being evicted. Again, the kind of how that depression affected them whilst they were in that accommodation needs to be carefully assessed and kind of weighed up and back, you know, kind of worked out what's going on for them there, because potentially they're not intentionally homeless at all. So there is a kind of a couple other ways which mental health issues would be relevant, and one would be where, when the council actually accepts a duty to house you, they need to take into account your mental health issues as they work out what type of accommodation is going to be suitable for you. Now, bearing in mind, a lot of councils don't carry out any sort of assessment at all, which actually makes it quite easy for a solicitor to challenge them. But let's say, for example, you've got someone with you know, significant PTSD. They need someone which is quiet and kind of, you know, peaceful, and not, you know, kind of an absolute zoo where there's lots of antisocial behaviour going on and lots of bullying and lots of exploitation going on. You know, I mean, no one should be put in that sort of accommodation anyway, but potentially you'd be able to make an argument to say this person has PTSD. The evidence from the medics is that they need someone which is quiet, self-contained, and you would be able to use that to, you know, I mean, particularly if you're a solicitor, you'd be able to use that to kind of get the council to actually make that sort of accommodation available to you. So yeah, that's kind of a way that might pick in there. And I think, as I say, there's probably more ways that this could all fit together and kind of become relevant, but that gives you an overview of how mental health is taken into account within housing law. And I would say housing law is pretty darn good, you know, in terms of kind of making those criteria available for people, so that, you know, just because you've been evicted because of abandoning the property or because you just couldn't cope in there, as I say, although some councils will say you're intentionally homeless, that doesn't necessarily mean that you are. And again, I would say the threshold for being in priority need through mental health issues is relatively low. certainly not as high as some people would say it is. Again, that key word is noticeable. Is there something noticeable about your condition which puts you at an additional risk of harm that a healthy and robust person would not be at? And that might be simply that your anxiety and depression is going to get much worse. You know, you don't have to kind of have a full breakdown to kind of qualify as being in priority need. So yeah, I mean, hopefully that helps. As I say, there's probably a lot more to say about it, but it just gives you an idea of, if you have current mental health issues, just maybe give you an idea of the ways in which the council should be dealing with you and taking it into account, and just generally being nice to you, basically, not being horrible. That's kind of a key thing. Shouldn't be horrible to anyone, but particularly where you've got these kind of issues. And I think it's probably an area where, just to kind of finish up, is that mental health issues are obviously by definition potentially easier to disregard than physical health issues. If you've got no legs, then the council's probably going to find it harder to dismiss that than if you have very, very significant depression. But both would be relevant as they kind of carry out their inquiries around priority need and around suitability, all those sorts of things. So yeah, so often, although you shouldn't have to, it's often helpful to go in armed with information from your doctor or from your NHS app or whatever, to show that you have these diagnoses. And I've certainly won arguments around priority need where, I mean, I'm not a medic, but I sought medical advice from treating professionals. And I also did research around, any sort of legitimate kind of document, like NICE guidelines, any government white paper, Royal College of Psychiatrists stuff. I remember doing a lot of stuff around that, around brain injuries for a guy. And I was able to kind of, get their information about their issues from the doctors, but then kind of expand that within the letters that I was writing to the council, and showed how these should be treated and how these would have a bearing on things like priority needs. So, as a non-medic, you can still refer to authoritative, kind of robust sort of evidence and guidance on it in order to make your argument that that person is in priority need or is not intentionally homeless or whatever. So if that helps.